Welcome to this evening's event. This is a Ruskin seminar devised by the artist Samson Kambalu, generously hosted by the Oxford Research Centre for the Humanities, with additional support as well from Magdalen College, the University of Oxford. My name is Emma Ridgway and my role is Chief Curator at Modern Art Oxford, where I lead the artistic programme of exhibitions and learning. I'm also the curator of the British Pavilion for the Venice Biennale in 2022. Importantly for this event, the artist Samson Kambalu has a major solo exhibition opening at Modern Art Oxford on the 22nd of May. It's titled New Liberia and it runs to the 5th of September this year. And particular congratulations to Samson today. A major press announcement, which some of you may have seen, is that Samson is on the shortlist of artists proposing new sculptures for the Fourth Plinth in Trafalgar Square, which is the most prominent art commission, public art commission in the UK. So Samson's sculpture, along with 6 other artists, will be on exhibition at the National Gallery in London from late May to July, and then there'll be 2 winners chosen for 2022 and 2024, which will be announced in the summer. So massive congratulations to Samson for being shortlisted, and we'll all be excited to see the works when they're unveiled. Now, right now, this event is slightly unusual. It's the second event of a series of 3, 2 in March and 1 in May. And it's unusual in its informality because you're invited to see behind the scenes of the artistic process of creating part of a contemporary art exhibition in formation. So in particular, it's the conversational play between the artist and curator as the exhibition concept is taking shape. It's focused on one aspect, although there's many in the show, which is of great interest to both Samson and I professionally, which is the influence of John Ruskin. For many, many reasons, most notably Ruskin's premise that art education is vital for everyone, because that's how we learn to really see the immediate reality of the world we're in as we live within it, as well as making our mark on it. And art education is a part of life because, in Ruskin's words, the teaching of art, as I understand it, is the teaching of all things. And as many of you know, he later crafted his work into a damning critique, really, of laissez-faire capitalism because of the dehumanizing alienation it caused and causes for so many people. And within that, he said, there's no wealth but life, life including all its powers of love, of joy, and of admiration. The event that Samson and I will do on the 25th of May, it'll be an in conversation when the exhibition's complete and open to the public. And conventionally, that's the first time viewers usually see an artwork presented when it's within an exhibition shape. And then there's comments by the artist, an interpretation by the curator or curators. And the reason that in conversations of this sort normally happen when a show has been made, particularly with new commissions and new installations, is because the artwork doesn't actually fully exist yet. And this particular show and these ideas are still the conversational form of exchanges between the artists and the curators and the production team. Samson Kambalu wanted to make this a more creative, open process, particularly for the benefit of the Ruskin students. So this seminar will be a performance lecture by the artist, focused on how Ruskin resonates with his practice. Then there may be an intervention there as well. And then I'll ask him some questions. And through the evening's lecture, if you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the Q&A or chat box. We'll catch them. And we'll do our best to answer as many of those as we can throughout the session. And then at 6:30, the main session finishes, and then we'll just roll on to a wider conversation with Samson and myself and co-curator Amy Budd too. As I mentioned last week, my role in this exhibition focuses on the concepts and interpretation of the exhibition, and Amy's focused on the production of the new works. And those are both roles that any commissioning exhibition has within them from the curatorial side. So Amy and I have joined forces with this one. And I'm now going to introduce Samson Kambalu. And it's useful to know that in engaging with contemporary art, that something useful to just bear in mind is that how we each individually think and feels really governs how we listen, and it's informed by all our own life experiences and assumptions and everything else we bring. And that governs how we listen and therefore what meanings we hear and pick up. And so for your mind to openly meet Samson's mind, it's useful to know that his approach to knowledge is both improvised, like jazz, and how it brings together ideas, and also contains quite a bit of propositional knowledge that's both creative and provocative in how he presents it. Samson, just a little bit of biog info here. Samson was born in 1975 in Chiradzulu in Malawi, and he studied at the University of Malawi, Nottingham-Trent, and took his PhD from Chelsea College of Art and Design. He also authored one of the first memoirs of a childhood in Malawi. It's called Jive Talker. It's from 2008. And his artworks have been exhibited around the world, including the Dakar Biennale, Tokyo International Arts Festival, Liverpool Biennale, and he featured in All the World's Futures, the Venice Biennale 2015, which was curated by Okwi Inweze. And he's also had some great solo exhibitions at Pier Gallery in London, in Musée in Ostend, the Whitechapel Gallery, the NSU Art Museum in Miami, and quite a few others. His works in collections, national collections, such as Tate, British Council, Contemporary Art Society. He's had research fellowships at Yale and the Smithsonian Institute, and you all probably know him better as the Associate Professor of Fine Art at the Ruskin School of Art, and also as a Fellow of Magdalen College. And I'd say from the conversations Samson and I have had over the last couple of years, there does seem to be a fascinating underlying motivation with some of his work around people better appreciating the personal lived experience of people in sub-Saharan Africa, and to gain a curiosity and interest in the syncretic, eclectic cultural influences that play out in Malawi. It's important also to know that he frequently refers to his work as praxis, as he regards his whole life as a creative project in process. And he expresses that through his exciting experiences from his life and ideas in art and writing from childhood to adulthood, in good part to encourage other people to join him in exploring core philosophical questions, such as what is individual freedom and sovereignty. So whatever you're expecting from a seminar on Ruskin, please enjoy just how much this event will creatively disrupt your own expectations. And it's with that that I very happily invite Samson to come on screen and say
bye. Thank you very much for your kind introduction, Emma. And thanks for doing this with me. You know, thanks for the solo show you have offered me. And yes, it's brought all this. And also thanks, Torch, for supporting this. There's Liz there, there's Barbara, who are supporting me in this. Thank you very much. Okay. I want to start this with a film I made in the United States. And this is called Runner. And this is in 2014 when I was doing a fellowship at Yale in Connecticut, in a place called Noah. Can I make this film? This is called Runner. The thing I noticed about America was that you hardly saw nature in the American landscape. What you saw instead was history. So this is one of the interpretations of the histories I saw in the American landscape called Runner. Yeah. Okay, so last time I said that I would bring in a head and then improvise around it. The idea of the head comes from jazz. There's the main theme, there's the main tune, and then you improvise around it. It reminds me of the idea of the head in Nyao masking in Malawi, where I'm coming from. This is a head. I think it's called Elvis. It's from some museum in America. I just dragged it off the internet. And so this is what I'm doing. In Nyao, the same, we have a head and then you improvise around it. See how this starts, how this works. The last time my head was called Ruskin and the Problematic of the Gift, Ruskin and the Problem of Giving. This time, the head I have is called Ruskin and the Idea of the End of Art. Or if you want a more sensational take, is Ruskin and the Idea of the Death of Art. The concept is based on Hegel's writing on aesthetics, the idea of art coming to an end. It's Hegel, and it's as and the way I apply it to Ruskin is as explored in recent times by American philosopher Arthur C. Danto. And I will use the idea of the death of art to demonstrate how important Ruskin is to contemporary art, and also his place actually in contemporary art, especially as put forward by the curator who just passed away, sadly, Akue Nwenzo, a very critical, I think you would hate that I spelled his name that way. There's not supposed to be an end there. He put this two critical shows. One was called A Short Century in 2002. This was in 2002 in Munich, and there was another one earlier on. The much later was A Short Century. You can see some of the work that were featured. Short Century in African art. And then he did another one in Venice called All the World's Futures. And this is where he invited me when I was doing my fellowship at Yale. And I noticed that he was more impressed that I was doing my fellowship at Yale, I think, being a scholar. So anyway, he invited me and he asked me, what do you want to do? And I said, well, I'm looking at situationism. In fact, I went to Yale to research William Blake, psychogeography in William Blake, but I found this huge archive that an Italian situationist, Sanguinetti, had sold to Yale under controversial circumstances, because the situationist, a movement in the 50s, led by a Frenchman called Guy Debord, was all about the potlatch sharing. And when I was at doing my fellowship there, Sanguinetti had sold this archive to Yale for $2 million. And so what I did was just to photograph the whole archive over 4 months. And when Okwi invited me to Venice Biennale, after we had a meeting in New York, I just displayed this archive in Venice, and this is it. And of course, Sanguinetti sued us, but he was demanding that the whole installation be taken down and that the publication be scrapped. So this was huge, and Venice Biennale had a fight with Sanguinetti, the whole Biennale, actually. But it was kept a secret. Anyway, in the end, Sanguinetti didn't win the case, and the judge saw it differently. He says, you can't be telling people that art should be a form of potlatch, and then when they take your stuff, display it in public and say that they need to ask for copyright. Anyway, there's one person who asked for copyright from the situationists, and they refused them. They said that if you're asking us for copyright, then you don't understand what situationism is. Therefore, don't use our stuff. So I didn't ask, I just went for it. Anyway, this is how my interpretation of what I was looking at in the archive. The close-ups. My work always evolves around cinema. So I made this huge book called Sanguinetti Thesis. It had his name on the front, and then my name was on the side like a publisher, you know. And yeah, it is playful. It wasn't just simply putting the research out there, but I played with it, as you can see. And the way I played with it is from my activity with film. A lot of things I do come from film, and you can see here it looks like a film strip, almost like a flip book, if you like, a flip book. Okay, so what I want to do is that some people failed to get into the seminar last time. I got some feedback, and I said, okay, I'm going to do a recap of what we talked about in the first seminar before I continue for the second seminar on Ruskin. In the first seminar, we looked at the notion of freedom that Ruskin found in the incompleteness of nature, under the influence of William Blake. That this notion of freedom is connected to individual sovereignty, socialized individual sovereignty, and the notion of unrestricted economics, gift economy, if you like. I'm interested in the gift because I'm coming from sub-Saharan Africa, and society there is still a gift. It's called underdevelopment, but in Africa, in Malawi, we call it's a culture of the gift. It's in my tribe, Nyao, it's called underdevelopment here, but I'll try to explain. In fact, it's this background in the gift economies of Southern Africa that brought me to Ruskin, why it intrigues me. We explored the idea of drawing in Ruskin, not as a representation, but as radical communication by means of the eye, the partial thing whose exception is the body. So when you're looking at a drawing, what are you looking at? Okay, and then we're still on his. I wanted to, we considered that when you're looking at, let's say, if you take Ruskin interpretation of drawing as radical communication, what are you really looking at when you look at this, let's say, pre-Raphaelite painting? This is by Millais. People think they are looking at a painting. Myself, considering what Ruskin meant by drawing, that's not what I'm seeing there. I'm seeing more of this. Well, let's start with Hegel's idea on Greek art. He says, when you're looking at Greek art, what are you looking at? A lot of people see the figure, but for Hegel, what you're looking at there is the eyes, the roving eye, of the artist sculpting. This, what Hegel thought was replaced in Greek art, was this here. You're looking at a thousand-eyed monster, the Argus. And for me, the same. When I'm looking at Ruskin here, I'm more looking at not this man here, but this cheerful monster with 1,000 eyes. So, and then from there, we also looked at the idea that Ruskin's idea on education opened up to the possibility of real knowing, before the utilitarian uses of what we have in education now. What I did last time, when I talked about Ruskin and the idea of drawing and its relationship to education, I stood up with the scissors and I cut a piece, as you can see, of my gown. I think the arm there you can see, it's amputated. And well, the gown now has been stitched. What I'm gonna do with the gown is give it a stitch and you'll look. All right. Now, the next thing we looked at is the idea that Ruskin was reduced by the world of things in which he was born. His parents were wine merchants, into the trade, if we like. And we say that Ruskin parents put him in debt, and only an ascetic life and eventual decline into madness afforded Ruskin the ability to settle that debt, if you like. We think that Ruskin learned from that, the predicament he found himself being born to parents in trade, and he sought out ways of giving, proper ways of giving. And this, again, he learned in nature. We say that Ruskin's discovery of the incompleteness of reality or nature as a fetish led him to consider a life of generosity. And Ruskin realized that the real giving actually is beyond exchange. If you watch nature, nature gives indifferently. And this is what Ruskin is inspiring to, a form of kind of what you could perhaps describe as secret giving. I thought that the kind of giving that Ruskin learned in nature is akin to, like in Malawi. We don't have systems of exchange. Instead, we have potlatches that are orchestrated by masks. You can see that the masks in Malawi, masks like Ruskin, they depict this understanding of nature as partial, nature as infinitely generous, if you like. So the idea of secret giving around masking is what I think is happening around Ruskin's idea of drawing. Ruskin found this idea of secret giving actually in the Middle Ages. People wonder why he had this atavistic approach. Why the Middle Ages? I would argue that it's in the Middle Ages that Ruskin found this idea of secret giving that's in nature. How did things work in the Middle Ages? Well, you went to church if you wanted to give. You hardly gave it to your neighbor. You took your gift to the church and the church gave it to your neighbor. And the neighbor said, oh, I got this from God. So that's eliminating obligation, eliminating the very same obligation that Ruskin found himself to his parents through the world of open generosity, if you like. So Ruskin is interested in the Middle Ages for this alternative economy that he would like to introduce alongside art or drawing, if you like. So we looked at how Ruskin's institutions, such as the Ruskin School of Art, propose the idea of a potlatch economy, secret potlatch economy beyond exchange. And we explored Ruskin communist idea of Venice. I don't think there's a coincidence that there are masks in Venice and there are masks in Malawi. I think that the Ruskin felt an economy, the secret economy there of this kind of indifferent generosity that was found in the Middle Ages, either at the cathedral or in the open square. All these things had been given away to capital by the time Ruskin was writing, and it was an attempt to retrieve some of it. So yeah, Ruskin's communist utopia of Venice. We finally looked at how Ruskin radicalized ideas of his parents, including tourism and interpassivity. People accuse Ruskin of being conservative despite his talk of certain fundamental freedom, But I always say that if you look again, Ruskin looks like the thing, but he had radicalized the thing. So he does look like a Tory, owned a lot of property, a wealthy man. He puts together all these institutions, but if you scrutinize his approach, where his parents indeed invested in art, etc., their aim was more capital. Ruskin does the same. He invests in art. He supports artists. In fact, you could say the ascetic Ruskin lives interpassively through the artists that he supports and the students that he teaches. But if you look at that, it's not more directed toward exchange, but rather a life of radical generosity. This I find attractive as an African. So anyway, talking about radicalization, we thought, well, we've spoken earlier about radicalizing the idea of the Oxford Don or the Oxford teacher. So we proposed that we would build an elephant out of these pieces of MA gowns that I have. This is one I wear. We proposed this elephant that we're going to build for a modern art Oxford, as alluding to Ruskin's ideas of education as an occasion for real knowing, not just a career, but a way of living well and a way of daring to know. They say there's a difference, right? Maybe an Oxford tutor more knows a number of facts, but what Ruskin is proposing is an Oxford Don or a tutor who really knows, who dares to know stuff, not just a keep of facts, but somebody who knows. This is a Malawian Nyau's masking structure, and it's from 1960. And I thought it had this Giacometti trunk in there, this kind of deceptive reading of space. Well, I'm curious at how it will look at modern art, but I would like to emulate this terrific mask that looks like the gowns, the billowing gowns of the Oxford tutor or student, if you like. And last time, somebody offered to send us a free gown. So I would encourage that. I would say that if you're buying into this idea and you'd like to contribute to this elephant, we actually will build 2 elephants. And somebody asked me, are they male or female? They are actually, this elephant is both male and female. So it's just 2 elephants. It's a repetition of the Ruskin drawing elephant. And it will move about the room at modern art to light. Okay. Before I continue, I want to invite Charles to present.
All right, thanks, Samson. Yeah, so when I first moved to Oxford in September, the first thing that really grabbed my attention were these emperor heads at the Sheldonian Theatre, which are at the bottom of this image. They have a really commanding presence, but they're not of any particular bearded men. Thus, they kind of exist as caricatures of the positions they're in. That's some close-ups of all the guys. The current generation was mounted in 1972, and the first 2 generations from 1669 and 1867 are now slowly decaying in various locations across the city. And I went on kind of a headhunt for some of them here. And in last week's seminar, Samson mentioned, just kind of paraphrasing, when you get rid of something without thinking about the replacement, what you get is a ghost of the thing you were trying to get rid of. And I feel like Oxford has made me believe in ghosts, what it means to be everywhere at once. And I feel wary of ghosts who are still capable of generosity, as they're usually misdirected or even malicious. The heads eventually led me to Thomas Shrimpton and Son, which was a print shop that existed nearby the Emperor heads from 1868 to 1901. And I'm going to go through just some of my personal favorite examples. There's an archive in the library here. They produced original caricatures focused on university life and its personalities, politics, rituals. These were usually produced by undergraduates for undergraduates, but I'm really more interested in the logic of caricature than caricature itself.
snarky responses.
We need a film about how people get a little bit too big for their boots. We need a film about boring people. We need a film about people who think they're boring. We need a film about people who don't get fights. What do we need a film about?
I have no idea.
We need another film about not knowing.
We need lots of films. We need a series. BBC drama about not knowing.
At least 3 seasons.
I found it really funny how serious everyone is at Oxford. There's kind of an underlying recognition that to be a student or professor or whatever here is something you should be ashamed of, something you shouldn't talk about, as if it's any different from any other academic institution at its core. So I wanted to have some fun and scream publicly in the streets for a bit. This proposal or pitch we need a film about is in an absurd relation with the origins of cinema, and in some way the times centuries ago when Oxford was not a tool of utility or capital, but more a place to read and get drunk. And this is some footage, some raw footage from a film I'm working on, which is very loosely based on the Shrimpton collection. And last week, one of the many questions Samson proposed was this: John Ruskin set up the school as a form of giving, but today, is it still giving? So I'm left wondering what happens when the gift rots. The generosity as self-sacrifice degrades, and people are left with this unwieldy thing that feels further and further away from any form of giving or generosity. I aim to represent the grotesque as it is through slowness and stillness, as modes of resistance, and caricature as critique, a violent degradation of the referent in the body, in the text, and in the world. Nobody can be pure, but it's hard to maintain a dissonance and a consonance, holding multiple positions within, and to not just withdraw. Trying to let go of the promise and trying to get toward the ambivalence.
Okay. I want to talk about an artist who appeared in London in the late 19th century by the name of Jane McNeill Whistler, a wandering American who claimed to have been born in Russia, but apparently was not. And he seemed to have picked up on Ruskin's idea of animatic idea of drawing, you know? Drawing as a form of radical communication. He painted some abstract landscapes and portraits that had this kind of these vacuous fields around them, the figures, you know, that record aspects of tenor and, you know, the famous painting we looked at last time by David Marat, the Mad Marat, which marked the failure of the French Revolution, in my opinion, because the revolution couldn't account for this void above Marat. What is that? I would like to propose that actually Ruskin began to take account of this void, and it appears in James Whistler. Here you can see. In Whistler, art seemed to move beyond the mimetic paradigm into radical abstraction. He titled his work after music. You know, this was new. You can see the title here is Harmony in Amber and Black. It's like a piece of music. So obviously, I think Whistler was pointing to something beyond representation, and you'd think he's coming close to Ruskin there, but when Ruskin actually saw his painting, he did not approve. This is a famous painting, Nocturne in Black and Gold, that Ruskin saw in one of the galleries in London, and he wrote this famous reaction in his blog, in Fos Clavigera. He says, "I have seen and heard much of Cockney impudence before now, but never expected to hear a coxcomb ask for 200 guineas for flinging a pot of paint in the public's face. That's it. Yeah, Whistler was known for art. Yeah. It's just, you know, well, now we see a lot, but I'm sure it must have been a shock when this painting was first exhibited in London then. Which is strange, actually, because Ruskin was a self-confessed coxcomb. Coxcomb is a form of like meow, you know, it's like a form of gule, what we call them in Malawi, the mass character with license. The coxcomb was the individual outside society in medieval in medieval. It was a courtier outside the norms of society. So the coxcomb in specific court was allowed to say whatever, pretty much like maybe the king's fool was allowed to say whatever they wanted. And Ruskin fancied himself as a coxcomb, writing. And so it's as if he's flinging this pot of paint at himself. But when we now understand Ruskin's notion of drawing, we can see why he disapproved, you know. Ruskin, ahead of his time, I think found Whistler's approach not radical enough, you know, for its formalism. For his formalism, Whistler was exploring the idea of the ending of art. Art could no longer express this radical freedom that that Ruskin or Blake had discovered in nature, and so he was going formal. And yet for Ruskin himself, art was already dead. So he must have found this frustrating. So I can see why he would have opposed. This is not so much radical communication. This is more a commentary on the limits of representation. And I can sense Ruskin's impatience looking at these paintings. He had already moved beyond the idea of the end of art. Hegel, according to Hegel, he says that art had to come to an end after the revolution, the French Revolution, because the people's proper realization of freedom, once somebody has truly grasped the meaning of sovereignty or the meaning of freedom, they move beyond the need for art to represent that freedom. It's as if that freedom enters life itself and art is no longer needed. Life itself becomes the art form. And so how does Ruskin's approach, Whistler's approach differ from Ruskin? Well, yeah, for Ruskin, although he has presentation here, you can see it's no longer about presentation. These drawings are more symbolic. He has already moved beyond this idea of the classical mimetic paradigm, art as a representation, to the idea of art as a form of radical communication. Then, if you think of art as a radical communication for drawing, or in other words, drawing for Ruskin takes many forms. It's not just with pencil, watercolors. It can be photography, it can be painting, sculpture, etc. So he is a famous, there was a lot of caricature in those days. So mainstream. These things I identify. Well, when Whistler read Ruskin's blog, he sued and he won. He was paid a farthing, and that farthing delayed Ruskin's ideas for almost a century. Because when Whistler won the case, the libel against Ruskin, art went formal. Modern art, what we know of modern art, and Ruskin's ideas of a socialized praxis, art as a form of drawing, become to be seen as kind of esoteric and kind of bizarre, strange, and mad. According to Danto, Arthur C. Danto here, this book I would recommend. He says that formalism was only being able to put in its track by the coming of Warhol, right? Warhol, when he exhibited the Brillo box. Yeah. Like Ruskin, Warhol, for art was hardly about expression, you know, or let alone representation. For Warhol, art was more about a certain kind of radical communication about our being in the world, you know, an ability to like conceive ourselves as part of a larger scheme of things. When I look at Warhol, I'm reminded of this, Elvis, the Nyao Elvis. So I always say that if you want to know where Ruskin returned for me after 100 years in exile, it's with this Brillo box. This is the work of art that, according to Danto, says broke down the division between art and life. This is when suddenly art itself became the stuff of art. So this idea of the end of art, or the return of Ruskin, actually, if you would like to call it, then opened doors for other forms of art. Before this Brillo box, places like in Africa is seen as primitive, right? Backward. Why can't they draw properly in Africa? Why can't they represent properly? After this box, people begin to read African art. And this is a thesis that Okui Enwenzo puts forward in his book, A Short Century, this one. The idea of art as expressing spirit beyond representation was already happening. Africa was having its own modernity, while in the West, people were busy exploring formalism in art. In Africa, Africans are already picked up on the ideas of Ruskin. In other words, you could say that what Ruskin was driving at was already there, live and kicking, had been for hundreds of years in Africa. Okay. So this is Okui's radical show, Short Century, which proposed art, African art, not just as painting or kind of, you know, but everything, anything that can express spirit, anything that can express a radical sovereignty, anything that you can draw with to express a certain radical freedom can be considered art after Warhol. You know, it's no longer about representation. It's more about a radical communication. So, okay, this is, and then you also showed, of course, these ideas. Okui put them in at Venice, and this is another work I showed at Venice. This is The Last Judgment. It is basically 400 footballs plastered in pages of the Bible. I showed them. Okay, so how do we trace Ruskin's influence in contemporary African art? Well, we have to start with Gandhi, whose life was changed when he read Ruskin's Unto This Last, in which he spelled out his ideas of unrestricted economics, if you like. That he set up a commune in South Africa of the gift, if you like, of radical generosity that Ruskin was driving at, and he took that commune to India, and in India, by 1945, becomes independent, and this leads to disintegration of the British Empire, if you like. Here is Ruskin. Some people, this is Gandhi weaving, but I think he's drawing, in my opinion, by my understanding of what Ruskin meant by drawing and its relationship to the social. This, for me, for Gandhi, was a great draw, if you like, in the social. Gandhi's ideas inspired Pan-Africanism and many other movements in Africa. And they soon, too, became independent, like Malawi became independent under Banda, where I'm coming from. But the Africans also, we made the same mistake of the French Revolution. We failed to radicalize. We got rid of colonial power, British colonial power. What did we have? Dictators. So this is what happens. People ask, why is Ruskin suggesting change within the same thing? Maybe Ruskin realizes that change without knowing what to replace it with. You get the very same thing you're trying to resist. There is something to be said about radicalizing instead of just iconoclasm, if you like. Okay, so this is Okui. Reading of African art was expansive. Before, African art was seen as inadequate, as a kind of just a half-baked kind of rendition of Western art. But after Okui, I think people begin to really see contemporary art and how it's connected to its traditions and indeed to history, if you like. In Malawi, it was somebody who would have been like Ruskin was this guy, John Chilembwe, and he was a Baptist preacher, educator, who believed that education was one way the African could reclaim his lost dignity, right? And Chilembwe employed photography a lot as a form of drawing. His photography is arresting, it stays with you. This was in 1915, months before he was killed for the right to wear a hat before a white person. This was illegal, by the way. This photograph looks ordinary, but you were not allowed to wear a hat before a white person, or even shoes. So this is, Chilembwe had a friend, he recruited a white friend, had this photograph taken and distributed to his followers, and then he read a revolution, an uprising to bring, to turn Nyasaland, Malawi, what was Malawi called then, into this new Liberia. That's where I get the title of my short form, his idea that he wanted to change Malawi into new Liberia, a place of unrestricted economics. He was also that, his mission was called Providence Industrial Mission. Again, he picked up on the ideas of generosity beyond exchange, ideas that really fit well in the African context. Anyway, this is the guy who eventually inspired Banda, but Banda twisted it for his own ends. Okay, this is the destruction of Chilembwe Church when he rose up against British rule in 1915 to bring New Liberia to Malawi. The colonial police, you can see here, they razed this church to the ground. By the way, he had built this church in defiance, because as an African, you were not allowed to build a church. Only white missionaries were allowed to have a mission. And Chilembwe got in touch, connected with African Americans, and built this church and wore a hat before a white person. And this is what he got in return. His mission was razed to the ground. And we can learn something. Again, Chilembwe, I think he built this church as a form of performance. I will show you why. How. Maybe we should look at this film by the Lumiere brothers. One of the early films by the Lumiere brothers. It's about a war. Days of early film, 19th century. Okay, how is that connected to me? I'll show you. This is a film I made 3 years before I was appointed as tutor at Ruskin and as fellow at Magdalen. So I came here to Oxford as a tourist. and I made this film. And it's called Dawn. So 3 years before I was appointed Professor of Fine Art at Oxford. So you see, cinema can be a form of prayer, if you like. Okay, and okay, so I just want to then finish by talking about the Ruskin School of Art. Drawing. Well, the Ruskin School of Art in the 20th century, I would want to the school maybe to be more embracing of this radical idea of drawing, you know, which I'll propose by cutting off my gown. I think a Ruskin tutor, an Oxford Don, if you like, is the one who dares to know. Not just a keep of facts, but the one who dares to know. All right, thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Samson. That was really fantastic. Really brilliant, wonderful run through of the ideas. And thanks also to Charles. So Charles actually was in when we had this second half section of the event, which we're going to roll into now as a more of an open conversation. Last week, Charles actually asked some questions and mentioned his work around the gowns, which is contributed then to this event. So it is genuinely, we're interested to hear people's thoughts and ideas, because it is through conversation that we sharpen up our thinking and ways of understanding things. I was really taken with that presentation, Samson, and I thought it was a really great place to conclude as well. The idea of a scholar at Oxford or anywhere, self-taught as well, is the one who dares to know. Now, plenty of people who are fellow philosophy readers will also know that's very much Kant's Declaration for the Enlightenment as a statement, and that there's been huge amounts of unintended consequences and some pretty awful acts that are attributed to the Enlightenment as well. But there is something exceedingly important to redeem from the intention of many of those ideas as well, which Samson's alluding to, as regards the idea of, for example, the radical scholar, the idea that scholarship is not to hold a piece of knowledge, but is the concentrated focus on trying to understand the world as you move through it. And particularly the idea of the radical scholar, or the radical person, being one who is really thinking within the wider scheme of things and looking for change. And that is very Ruskinian. And that's partly how our exchange of conversations started around Ruskin, ultimately, and thinking about the Ruskin School of Art and the college and the amount he did around the idea of education that influenced free secondary state education legislation coming in the UK and so many other things. And also I was struck, Samson, with you talking about the end of history, when actually it feels very much a moment that we're in now, which is very much a kind of a start of a new chapter in history, and a really fascinating turning point, which is something you're exploring with the idea of New Liberia. Can you talk a bit about that, and a bit maybe about the installation, but some ideas more about the New Liberia?
Yes. Yeah, the end of history actually is also an extension from Hegel. You know, he talks about the end of history. What is the end of history? It's a time for absolute knowing. So what is absolute knowing? Maybe this daring to know. Yeah, well, we know that for hundreds of years now, for maybe 200 years, education has more been going towards utilitarianism. It's only now that actually Ruskin is having a hearing. You know, people are interested in the environment. You know, these things are no longer taken for granted. Ruskin was already talking about the environment in the 19th century, and everybody thought it was mad. But now I think it's current saying that. So yeah. What is the end of history? Yes, the end of history is a time of knowing. For me, yeah, it's daring to practice what we know. The idea of a radical generosity, by the way, these are discoveries of quantum physics. You know, there's a puzzle in quantum physics. Why don't things add up in reality when they start the idea of a partial reality that Ruskin intuited or Blake intuited in nature is being found in science. So science can't have all the answers now. I think they just to say there has to be room for poetry, more poetry.
Yeah. Also, so much of science initially and philosophizing as the idea of a discipline that concentrates on trying to make sense of the world actually comes from observations of life and lived experience. And so there is always those interesting kind of feedback loops, I think. And Hegel, as I understand it, was specifically talking about the end of art as being marked with the end of beauty, which I know that those of us who work in contemporary art and modern art really don't talk about. And it's partly because the declaration was made so strongly by Hegel and then followed up in various ways by Adorno and others. But Hegel was really articulating an idea that I think is interesting in that he's talking about the aesthetic experiences of freedom. And it's those aesthetic experiences of freedom, which he calls beauty, which he says is what reconnects us kind of to each other. And there is something very compelling in that as an idea, to my mind. And
this is a kind of idea that you'll be shocked that I think this guy is the Nyao tradition, by the way. Nyao tradition is a UNESCO World Heritage. And when I'm reading Hegel, when I'm reading Zizek, it's almost like these guys already figured it out. You know, the idea of beauty as an expression of freedom, sovereignty. This is the African aesthetic. This is the that Ruskin is just reaching out to. So Hegel's notoriously nasty, but he was more projecting on Africa than really talking about Africa. But yeah, there is a feel that this is where things should go, Southern Africa. In my years in academia, there's a lot taken in from other parts of the world, Asia, etc. But Southern Africa is a region that hasn't been tapped into yet.
Absolutely. And as I understand it, one of the reasons why their philosophical tradition, so to speak, in the West has somewhat overlooked the cultural philosophies within Africa and sub-Saharan Africa is because of the premising on verbal transmission of knowledge being so much more dominant within various different ways of communicating wisdom. That's very different from the more taught priestly, you know, the roots of somewhere like Oxford University, actually, which puts different priorities on different forms of knowledge as to whether they're spoken or written. So there's lots of reasons as to why these very problematic exclusions happened. And whilst people think they're exploring and navigating the world, they're actually exploring and navigating small sections of reading lists or books that are actually far more narrowly inscribed. And what you do find that, you know, the bigger the thinker sometimes. I mean, I'm a huge fan of Spinoza and have been since reading him at university, actually, because he talks about joy and the idea that every single person is capable of deeply philosophizing and coming to understand a richer understanding of the world, their place in it, just sheerly through paying attention, being curious and managing their emotions such that ideas such as joy and really crafting your profession, and that these things that are really fundamental to all people are available to people in a much richer way than was thought. Obviously that got him into huge amounts of trouble at the time, and he couldn't publish in his lifetime because of what those messages say about hierarchies. But it is fascinating, this, when people really deeply consider what it is to live and what the human condition is, whatever the era or the place, there can be these big connection points to pre-capitalist notions of connectivity through nature and something much larger. There's a couple of points here, which is great. So Carol asks, is partial reality an oxymoron like fake news is? So that's one. Point. Samson and I actually articulate that slightly different. I'd say part of an infinity, and Samson refers to it as partial reality. And then on a perhaps different note, how does gaslighting play into this? Not sure which bit of this for us. We can ask more.
Right.
And did Ruskin dislike Whistler's Nocturne because it was an example of partial reality and gaslighting? So gaslighting tends to be understood currently as a form of sustained emotional abuse. So I'm not quite sure I'm fully understanding the point there. Thus, the viewer was fooled into thinking throne paint was actually art. So maybe, Carol, please correct me, but is it that essentially the emotionality of Whistler is a form of manipulation? Might have been something that Ruskin objected to. Samson, do you have thoughts in relation to that?
Yes, the partial thing, that's actually science. You know, I always wondered, you know, you may ask me why I'm going about partial. When I was growing up, all the masking I saw around, the partial thing was what was treasured in Africa. You know, when people took you to the shrine of their ancestors, or you see trash. When you go to the witch doctor shows you a pile of rubbish. When the masks come out, they are covered in partial things. Never the whole, why is that? What, for a long time, this was seen as insane, but actually these are discoveries of science. That reality is a piece of fragment floating in the ether, in what Zizek would like to call the less than nothing, this kind of positively charged void in which every now and then matter manifests, as you know. So that partial thing for me indicate our connections to the infinite. It's not saying that that's precisely the part where we are connected to the infinite. And Africans, I think, have understood this. There must have been, in fact, in Africa, to get initiated into adulthood is to realize that reality is a fetish. You know, a child is the one who takes the fetish for the fetish. An adult is the one who realizes that it's mostly fetish. It's all fetish, actually, and you're just alone. Gaslighting. Gaslighting. Yeah, yeah. Well, I don't want. This is the difference between Whistler and Ruskin. Ruskin will tell you that there's nothing to express, and I believe that as well. That all we are is on the outside. If you want to understand yourself, don't look within. Look at the world in front of you and try to understand it. And if you can, maybe you don't understand yourself. So if you understand, this is, by the way, German idealism. What do you find from like philosophers like Schelling? What do you find? Do you find a rational human beings at the heart of a person, or you find this kind of what's called the dark night of the soul? You know, I think that in Africa, that's what we believe. There's nothing to be discovered inside. All you can be is in front of you. Go back to community. What you think is inside, what you think is a real you is what's imaginary, and that's what has to be rendered into masking, and then go some kind of ritual circumcision. In Nyao masking, actually, the most important time is not the mask itself. It's when you're taught to no longer dance, to get off the open. So emotions don't really, is it Freud who said the only emotion you should trust is anxiety? So I don't know whether we will buy anything into Whistler throwing paint that he's expressing anything there. I think Ruskin was onto something. Ruskin wanted a more kind of socialized communication rather than this so-called self-expression. It's a long story, but that's to make it long. So Ruskin is more with like Warhol, who made these impersonal works of art. Socialized, but impersonal. Warhol's hardly expressive. So all he had to say was said through the world in front of him. And this is, I think, what Ruskin is proposing. Yeah. And this is why he's against Whistler, for introducing art as a form of self-expression, as a form of kind of, yeah, he takes art to the territory that he's trying to, he misunderstands the partial thing. Sorry.
I wonder if there's an aspect where, I mean, I appreciated in both the seminars, the first one, the second one, that you address some of the kind of the things that really messed up Ruskin's reputation. I mean, his ideas really came into fruition and popularity through people like William Morris, who was hugely influenced by him, particularly around the environmental aspects and the idea of art engaging with nature, and those going through into other many different areas of life, as well as the influence on Gandhi.
But you see that the difference between with the influence of Ruskin here is that Ruskin remained part of the art remained part of the British society's superstructure rather than infrastructure. You see, when Gandhi took over the ideas of Ruskin, his ideas become the infrastructure. And in Africa, Ruskin's idea became infrastructure. Well, even if you talk about people like William Morris here, I don't know whether the Ruskin ideas really get adopted into the mainstream. In fact, it's famously that Ruskin was sidelined even in his own school. He hasn't been.
But I think that was partly because of the two life events that you highlighted that really, I mean, he's already quite, he's already eccentric, explores things in his own way. Then you have the emergence of the gossip about his first wife and speculation about that, which comes up far later, long after he's dead, actually, as an area of contention, combined with the Ruskin trial that didn't fully make sense coming from somebody who had advocated from art so long. And those things really dampened down people looking more closely at different things. And there's many aspects of how we sometimes think about art where there can be an overlooking historically at when artists have been very socially engaged. So someone such as William Morris writing pamphlets for the rights of women who were working on the streets, or the setting up of conservation areas because of the importance of nature. The idea that, again, very actively, proactively working against the alienation that was so apparent and is for many people still in their daily experience. And that kind of, and that was directly from Ruskin, as I understand it, because Ruskin wasn't reading Marx
yeah, but those ideas, unfortunately, Ruskin's ideas, there's a famous, is it Core, a guy, Lord Core, somebody who's famously sidelines Ruskin's ideas. When the British government establishes a curriculum for art education, Ruskin's ideas are cast out. So yeah, they do exist in the fringe, the likes of William Morris and the various people you've quoted here. But all I'm saying is that in Africa, Ruskin's ideas became this type of governments. And this is Ruskin's idea when he says a socialized praxis. Ruskin is not enough, is not happy enough with the idea of art as superstructure. Ruskin wants art as infrastructure. I don't know whether that's been adopted yet in Britain. I think that in Britain, art is still superstructure mostly. In Africa, the masks that you show, that I've showed you, they're at the heart of society. They are the economy. The idea that artists could lead an economy, I don't know when Britain will adopt that. But well, I suppose economists, maybe, yeah, those kinds of people. But yeah. So I don't know. I wouldn't. I really believe that there should be a proper return of Ruskin.
Some aspects, yeah.
And I would want. There's hope now in that contemporary art is more preoccupied with the governments are adopting contemporary art. You know, you're curating Venice Biennale 2022. I hope there is more towards that movement of involving art a lot in the way people look at the world, and not just something you do on the Sunday.
Yeah, I think that has been used for cultural power between nations. I mean, the Venice Biennale has been going a very long time. you know, over long periods, art has been used that way. And ideas of Ruskin, whilst he as a person, I think, was hugely discredited, when the Labour Party set up in the UK, they did adopt a couple of his kind of suggestions and ideas into their policy. And I was just thinking about a bit of our book swaps that we do. So it's something I do like a bit of an argument about things, in case you hadn't spotted that. And Samson sent me this book, which was one of great interest to him in terms of researching aspects around Chilembwe and really making sense of the influences that had come through his life. And so I sent him over this book, which came out last year, which is by Robert Hewison, who's a really impressive writer for his clarity on Ruskin. But one of the things that's compelling about Hewison's, this contemporary book of Hewison's, his most recent book, sorry, of Hewison's, is he talks about the applications of some of the Ruskin ideas and where they could be useful and where they actually are in action, so to speak. So I'm going to go to some of these questions. I'd like Amy to jump on as well when you're ready, Amy. Deirdre, thanks so much. Deirdre says, exactly, privilege and entitlement warp perception. Yeah, I mean, we all have a certain filter on how we see the world, and I think that it's hardest to see it clearest if you believe that you're right all the time. Carol asks a second question, which is, I'm going to just give you two questions, Samson. Is there a connection between the religion of animism and the practice of masking? Do animals serve as a surrogate for a power like a masked person does? And this assumes animism is practiced in Malawi. And then going to jump on to another question, so you jot down some points from that. A person who is an anonymous attendee says, I grew up in Sheffield, which Ruskin called the Florence of the North, and he did a lot in Sheffield. It's a very great thing to bring into this. His appreciation for the crafts of the steelworkers and proximity to the peaks, now the Peak District National Park, led him to establish Totley Commune and Sheffield to be the dolorous city of the dirty Don. Here the Don is our river and our teacher, a warning of what will become a warning of what will become of us in the face of pollution, unfettered greed and industry. What do you see as the parallels between your Nayu conception of debt and degeneration of the gift and the orchestration of gifts through the mask, including nature, in Ruskin's understanding? And does your understanding and praxis need to be generated from a dolorous state, that grieving the losses in a revolution?
Yes, good one. Okay, animism. Nyao is not a metaphysics. It's animatic rather than animist. Animism is more associated with metaphysics. You know, this is the domain of priests and witch doctors. Nyao is actually pretty historic, and it's more a science. You know, Nyao is closer to quantum physics. It's animatic in that it's a philosophy based on the observation of reality. And in Malawi, we have actually priests. We've got people who came after the Nyao, and they are always at loggerheads with the Nyao tradition, because Nyao is animatic, based on thinking. It's a thinking philosophy. Everything is done through thought. And then the priests come along. So there's always a loggerhead. I would say no, animism, no. Nyao is not animistic, it's animatic. This is different. I can't read my own handwriting. What was it? The second one, what was the question? Was on the dirty, what is the, please, yeah, the second one.
Okay. So the second
I can answer the Sheffield one.
Yeah. Okay.
This river snaking through Sheffield. Oh, that's good. I think that cathedral could take the form of the cathedral. That river could take a form of a cathedral, a place of secret giving. And I've visited Sheffield, yes. Why did I notice that? I noticed the river a lot. What happened there? But yes.
So there's a specific question nestled in there about the parallels between your conception of Nayu regarding debt and the degeneration of the gift, and then the orchestration of gifts through the mask, and how that relates to Ruskin.
So there's, as I say, where Ruskin has Venice or the cathedral, we have the mask. So Malawi doesn't have a big culture of exchange. People don't give each other gifts. Instead, they always have these perpetual ongoing raves around the masks, if you like. And it's at these raves that people exchange indifferently. So it's secretly, it's like museums try to do this now. If I take a drink from Emma when she's having an opening, I don't feel I owe her, but if I take her to a bar and she buys me a drink, I owe her. So the Africans avoid going to the bar. They just stay on the scene and rave there, and all the economics is done through there. So in that you can take or you can give without obligation. You know, people think that the problem of capitalism is just about greed. I can tell you that if all rich people were to leave their things on the outside, they wouldn't be picked up. You know, that's what happens. I know my father would not take anything he had it aimed himself. I don't think he would take anything from you. My father refused to take anything from anybody. He would rather usually starve to death. That was his pride. So it takes tremendous skill to give. So a river in this case could be that place. I don't know how people in Sheffield use the river, but I know in Switzerland it's that way in the summer. You know, I lived in Basel in 2010, and everybody takes off. We take all their clothes and we jump into the river, and it becomes this kind of an atmosphere of generosity. But that doesn't only need to come during summer, it has to be ongoing somehow. And some societies have incorporated the idea of secret economics, ongoing potlatches. These ideas are put forward by the situationists, by the way. And the situationists, what they used to do is that they would just write their books in bars. They would sit in bars and steal each other's ideas, and just kind of in a flurry of discussions, ideas will pass around and they would publish their books. So yeah, the river there could form that function, certainly.
I ask as well, Amy, to come in. I'm aware that we're at 7 o'clock.
Sure.
One of the things that characterises the Gulkami dances, as Samson explained to me, is there's a very sudden cut-off point. And that's what's going to happen to us at 7. We are wonderful friends Liz and Barbara at Torch. We'll be doing the end of the event then. Amy, can you say some words, final thoughts?
Yeah, I think I actually just wanted to ask Samson more about the cutting of the gown, really, and that gesture. We've spoken a lot about drawing as radical communication, and I really loved your reading of Chilembwe's Church as an act of drawing too, but there's also an element of, well, last week you talked about fragmentation or incompleteness, and I wondered, could you say more about that gesture of the cut? As an artist, we know for me, that kind of synthesis all these very kind of nuanced ideas, and I would just like to hear more about that, for where that came from for you.
Yeah, people like the principal mask in Kasia Malilo, I showed it last time, is a womb, so the idea of the cat is in philosophy, maybe it's this kind of radical negativity that German philosophers keep talking about. When I started making my films, I used to call them the Cat Republic, because I chop my footage a lot. And also, if you look at the way I make my flags, it's all about cutting. It's this kind of differentiation through the cat. And as I say, don't be fooled. With masking, what's more important is the cat. It's the vacuum. It's the vacuum, if you like. The very same thing that makes the animates the mask. This sense of radical absence. So the cat it's almost it's the cat, you know. Yeah, I think it's through the cat that we're connected to the infinity, and I use that a lot in my work. Again, as I say, it's a big inspiration from watching masks when I was growing up, but also film. The traveling projectionists that used to visit our villages, they would chop up the films to give them a more kind of animated African time. They would take Hollywood films and chop them up, rearrange them. And when I started making films, I started chopping them immediately. And it was actually a curator who told me, I would like to show your films. I was like, why? It's the films that I was making anyway, and I was putting on social media for my sisters. And for me, when I made a film, it was immediate that I had to chop it up, because such as the experience of watching films as a child, a sense of time. Yeah, so the cat alludes to this animatic philosophy. It's a scientific approach to life, actually. It's just, it's provident, you know. You can follow my work and see how catching things have been generous to me. The partial thing, if I knew totally what it represents, then maybe I wouldn't do it. But perhaps in psychoanalysis, what's called the object A, you know, it's an object that represents a part of you that you can't put into words. You know, this is where the radical communication begins, where words stop. Transference begins. A radical communication. This is where we are united as humans, in places where, you know, yeah, it's through the cat, if you like. Yeah, the cat animates film. The cat does everything. The cat is God, as far as I'm concerned. I don't know, but yeah, I used to wonder a lot. I was mystified growing up as a child in Africa. Why the partial thing? Why not the whole? Why are the witch doctors coming out with the partial thing? Where are the dancers? Why this stuff? But I think the meaning of this is being discovered in science. You know, it's to understand reality, it's to understand how things work. I think a certain basic understanding on how things work. Yeah, as I say, this is people can read terrific. This is I think it's terrific. Zizek, Zizek is a philosopher of the cat. So if you want to understand perhaps the idea of partial reality, the other thing I always say that Zizek reminds me of aspects of Ruskin, actually. So if you want to understand a bit about go for it. I think he doesn't realize how Nyawe he is, but when Zizek is finished, you find himself in Africa.
Zizek's drawing on Marx, isn't he? So he's got a slightly different lineage, but again, really grappling with that notion of alienation, what that means, and how one can overcome it as an individual or as a different community. And when we were talking about the cut stuff the other day, as the Samson was explaining to me, which I hadn't spotted before. We watched one of the videos of the dances, and that the super energetic dances that are worth watching online of the Gulwal Kalmu, the ancestral spirits or the different characters that are costumed, super energetic dances that happen. But then there's suddenly a shout from the chief that Samson can do best, and it just calls the whole thing to an abrupt stop, and immediately the performer just drops all their wild, amazing, fantastic energy they're bringing to the whole event, and they just stop and they walk away. And that is to demonstrate their maturity, to understand they're part of a community as well. And there's something about that I think is really compelling, and the idea of overcoming forms of immaturity. Kant talks about it as well, overcoming our self-imposed immaturity. He talks about the idea of figuring out where you sit. You can still be playful and wild and exciting and everything, then also knowing when things are suddenly going to stop and change.
Yes, I think this idea, going to the idea of the dawn, these ideas are already in Ruskin, and you should know that he's been ignored a long time, you know, even by his own school. So the idea of the Oxford don as one who knows is understanding that knowledge is not just about facts and getting a job, whatever. Knowledge is about life, living in truth, a meaningful life, if you like. And this is what Ruskin is suggesting, and perhaps I would like to symbolize through this partial. By the way, Oxford education was always partial, in my opinion, before the 19th century. Oxford, when I was invited, when I got this position at Oxford, perhaps I wouldn't have gone back to teaching. I was happy enough in London as an unemployed artist. But Oxford attracted me because of its ancient traditions, the very same things that perhaps make people want to run away from Oxford. For me, I think they have to be more embraced, but they have to be repositioned back to what they are, rather than what they stand for now, which is utility and privilege. I don't think that things were always like that at Oxford.
Yeah, there's aspects of the ritual performance, which is about building communities. And as Deirdre referenced earlier, when it's about building a notion of privilege, that's not compelling. But actually, when it's about building ideas of community, then that's really rich, that ritualistic. And Amy and I have chatted about as well, just the importance of kind of messy, open conversations that are really frank and just work through things, which is also a side of life that people don't always want to jump into feet first, but actually it is wonderfully enriching. Samson, thank you so much. It was a really super enjoyable lecture. Amy, big thanks to Charles as well, and Liz and Barbara, thank you very, very much for your orchestration of everything. It's been brilliant.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Emma.
Thank you, Samson.
And Barbara and